The night was cold, the kind of cold that gnawed at your bones and made you feel like the world had stopped breathing. In the dense woods outside Pinewood, the wind whispered through the branches like a secret, but it wasn't a comforting sound. It was the sound of something moving closer. Something dangerous. The moon hung low, casting pale, almost spectral light over the trees, making them look like dark, twisted figures huddling together, watching. A small figure darted through the underbrush, moving with a speed and purpose that seemed unnatural for one so young. A child, no older than 10, their small face pale and determined, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resolve. They wore nothing but a thin coat, the sleeves tattered at the edges, a patch of dirt smeared across their cheek. But it wasn't the dirt or the ragged clothes that made them stand out, it was the fire in their eyes. There was a fire in that child's eyes, one that could defy even the darkest forces that were closing in on them. The child's breath came in ragged gasps, the air sharp in their lungs, but they didn't slow. Every step was calculated, every move deliberate. They were not running for their own life, though. No, they were running for someone else's. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there, someone whose existence in this land had been condemned by the very system that controlled everything. They were running to protect a man, a fugitive, a runaway slave who had escaped from the grasp of those who would put him back in chains, and the child, despite their youth, had made a choice. They had made a choice to risk everything for someone they didn't even know, someone whose life depended on their actions. The sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and growing louder, echoed through the trees, snapping the silence like a whip. The child's heart raced in their chest, but they didn't hesitate. They couldn't. They had already made the decision. They had already promised. The child glanced over their shoulder, the shadow of figures moving between the trees, far too close for comfort. The air seemed to grow colder still, pressing against their chest like an invisible hand. The bloodhounds were near, too. You could hear their sniffing, their relentless search. Every scent in the air was a potential clue for them, every crack in the woods a path leading straight to the runaway. The child's pulse quickened, but they kept moving forward, eyes focused on the clearing ahead. And there, in the clearing, crouched the fugitive. The man, his clothes ragged and torn, his face a mixture of fear and exhaustion, was barely able to lift his head when the child approached. His breathing was shallow, each inhale a battle against the pain in his chest, the ache in his limbs. But when his eyes met the child's, something unspoken passed between them. Something fragile, yet undeniably real. The child stopped, standing over him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The man's face was etched with the kind of terror that comes from knowing that any second now, the hounds would be on him, the bounty hunter right behind them, and that nothing, could save him from what was coming. But then, in that still moment, the child crouched down, their small hand reaching out to touch his arm. The touch was soft, a silent promise, a bond formed in the cold of the night. The fugitive met the child's eyes once more, and for the first time since his escape, he allowed himself to believe that there might still be a chance, a sliver of hope, that someone in this world cared enough to fight for him. The child reached into the pouch they carried and pulled out a small piece of cloth, a ragged bandage that had once been part of their own family's linens. It was all they had, but it was enough. With trembling hands, they wrapped it around the man's arm, the one that had been wounded during his flight. He winced, but didn't pull away. There was no time to waste. The sound of the hounds grew louder, closer. The child looked back toward the direction they had come from, and for the first time, the weight of the situation crashed down on them. They had made a decision, but now, with the world pressing in, with the fate of the fugitive resting on their shoulders, they realized just how dangerous that decision was. If they were caught, there would be no turning back. No safety. No second chances. But the child's resolve did not waver. They turned back to the fugitive, their voice a quiet whisper that barely reached his ears. You need to go now. Before they find you. The man nodded, his face tense, filled with gratitude and something else, a deep, unspoken fear. He rose shakily, his legs unsteady beneath him, but the child's hand on his arm steadied him. They didn't speak again as they moved, slipping through the woods like ghosts, the sound of the hounds baying echoing in the distance, growing fainter as they made their way deeper into the forest. Every step felt like it could be the last. Every branch that snapped underfoot felt like it could be the one that gave them away. But the child led the way, guiding the fugitive through the trees, towards the place they knew would offer the only hope of safety. A small cabin, hidden in the shadows of the woods, where no one would think to look. It was a place where secrets could be kept, where a runaway could be protected, even for a short time. As they reached the cabin's door, the child paused for just a moment, their small hand resting on the old wood. There was something ancient about the place, something steeped in history and memories that weren't their own. For just a moment, the child allowed themselves to wonder what life would be like after this, what would happen to them and the fugitive once they were safe. Would they be caught? Would anyone ever know what they had done? Would they be seen as a hero, or would they simply fade into the background, their actions forgotten by history? But there was no time for these thoughts. They couldn't afford to waste another second. They pushed open the door and ushered the fugitive inside, closing it softly behind them. The fugitive sank to the floor, exhausted and trembling, and for a moment, the child stood there, watching him, a silent guardian in the dark. The winds howled outside, the storm growing fiercer with each passing minute, but inside, in the quiet of the cabin, the child's heart finally began to slow. They had done what they could. They had chosen the path of defiance. And now, it was a matter of waiting to see if that choice would destroy them, or if it would be the spark that would ignite something greater. The child turned, glancing out the window at the darkness that seemed to stretch on forever, a feeling of unease settling in their chest. The night was far from over, and the consequences of what they had done were yet to unfold. But for now, they were safe. For now, they had won a small victory in a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. And as the winds howled outside, the child stood tall, their heart beating with the knowledge that, for at least one fleeting moment, they had made a difference in the world. The town of Pinewood, nestled deep within the heart of Georgia, was the kind of place that seemed to stand still in time. It was the summer of 1864, and the air was thick with the weight of a world on the brink of destruction. The scent of magnolia and wet earth lingered in the warm breeze, and the distant hum of cicadas filled the silence of the long, lazy afternoons. Life moved at its own pace in Pinewood, slow and deliberate, with the sun casting long shadows over the small, dusty streets. For many, it was a paradise, an idealized version of the South, where traditions were upheld, the land was rich, and the future seemed as secure as the plantations that dotted the horizon. But beneath the surface of this idyllic town, a storm was brewing, a storm that had been gathering for decades, as the United States teetered on the edge of civil war. Pinewood, like so many other towns across the South, was divided. The land was steeped in a history of blood and sweat, the product of a system that had been in place for generations. The economy of the town depended on the labor of enslaved black people, their hands bound to the land by chains, their bodies seen as property rather than human beings. In the distance, the grand estates of wealthy plantation owners rose like monuments to an old world, their sprawling fields of cotton, tobacco, and sugar symbolizing both prosperity and oppression. The people of Pinewood were not blind to the larger conflict that was raging around them. On the streets, whispers of the war grew louder each day. News from the front lines filtered in slowly, carried by travelers or messengers, bringing tales of battles fought and blood spilled. The air seemed to crackle with a kind of dread, the tension palpable. There were those in Pinewood who supported the Confederacy, fiercely loyal to the Southern cause, believing in the necessity of preserving their way of life. They viewed the war as a fight for their homes, their families, and their right to maintain control over the land they had worked for generations. Then there were those who, though they lived in the same town, viewed the war in a different light. They saw it as a battle for the freedom of the oppressed, a conflict that would change the course of history and hopefully bring about an end to the centuries of injustice. But these voices were quieter, drowned out by the fervent cries of those who sought to preserve the status quo. Pinewood was a microcosm of the South itself, divided, uncertain, and poised on the edge of a precipice. At the heart of the town, in the shadow of the grand plantation houses, stood the homes of those who worked the land. Small cottages, nestled together in neat rows, housed the families of both free people and enslaved men and women. These homes were modest, the walls thin, and the rooms small. Life in these homes was hard, a struggle against hunger, disease, and the constant threat of violence. But even in these conditions, there was a sense of community, a sense of belonging. The people who lived in these homes shared a bond, one born of necessity but also of deep humanity. They looked out for one another, helped each other in times of need, and carried the weight of their circumstances together. Yet, despite this community, there was no denying the underlying fear that permeated every interaction. The fear of being caught, of being punished, of being torn from loved ones and sold to the highest bidder. The fear of the law, a law that upheld the system of slavery, that saw black people as property, as something less than human. This fear was a constant companion, lurking just beneath the surface of everyday life, reminding everyone of their place in the world. The town of Pinewood was a place of contradictions. The homes of the wealthy stood in stark contrast to the small, humble cottages of the workers. The lush fields of cotton and tobacco that stretched out before the grand plantation seemed to be a world apart from the dirt paths and ramshackle houses where the workers lived. But the divide went beyond the physical landscape. It was a divide that ran deep within the people themselves, a divide that shaped their thoughts, their actions, and their very identities. In Pinewood, the world of the enslaved and the free was tightly bound together. On one hand, the wealthy landowners depended on the labor of the enslaved to maintain their status and wealth, while on the other, the free black people of Pinewood lived in constant danger of being swept up into the system themselves. The people of Pinewood knew that, at any given moment, their lives could change forever. The law could take away their homes, their families, their very humanity, and turn them into nothing more than property. They were caught in a system that had been in place for centuries, and the choices they made, whether to stay, to fight, or to flee, were never easy. In the midst of this social and political landscape lived a family not unlike many others in Pinewood. They were small-scale farmers, struggling to make a living off the land, just barely scraping by. They were not wealthy, not part of the privileged class that controlled the town, but they had a sense of stability. They were free, their land was theirs, and they had no direct stake in the system of slavery that governed the town. Yet, even for them, the tensions of the time could not be avoided. The father, a man of quiet resolve, worked the fields every day, his hands calloused from years of labor. The mother, a woman with a kind heart but a strong will, tended to the household, ensuring that everyone had enough to eat and that the family's small farm stayed afloat. And then there was the child, a curious, bright-eyed young boy, the youngest of their children. He was a child of Pinewood, born into this world of contradictions, raised in a home where love and labor went hand in hand, where every day was a fight for survival, yet every day was also a lesson in compassion, in understanding, and in the fierce will to survive. The child's world was small but rich in its own way. The house was modest, with rough-hewn wooden beams and a stone fireplace that crackled with warmth in the winter. Outside, the land stretched out in all directions, fields of wheat and corn, rows of vegetables, and a few cows that provided milk for the family. The child spent his days playing in the fields, learning the rhythms of the land, and listening to the quiet murmur of the adults around him. It was here, in this world of hard work and simple pleasures, that the child first encountered the fugitive. The child didn't know who the man was at first, only that he was a stranger, someone who had been running for days, hiding in the shadows, always one step ahead of those who would capture him. And yet, despite the danger, the child felt something in the fugitive's eyes, something that spoke to him in a way no one else had before. In that moment, the child saw not just a runaway slave, but a man who had been broken by the world, someone whose struggle for freedom mirrored their own quiet struggle for a better life. It was this moment, this quiet encounter in the fields of Pinewood, that would forever change the child's life, and in turn, the history of this small, divided town. The child didn't know it then, but they were about to make a choice that would carry them into a world of danger, of betrayal, and of a moral conflict that would forever mark their place in the tangled, bloody history of the South. And as the sun set over the cotton fields and the shadows grew longer, the winds of change were already beginning to stir in Pinewood. The winds of war, of division, of a world that was on the verge of unraveling. The man stumbled through the woods, his breath ragged, his body aching from the relentless days of running. His hands were raw, his feet bloodied from the sharp rocks and the unforgiving earth beneath him. Each step he took felt heavier than the last, but he had no choice but to keep moving. He had to. The hounds were still hot on his trail, their baying echoing in the distance, like a terrible omen drawing closer with every passing second. He could hear them sniffing the air, tracking him, honing in on his scent. They were relentless, and no matter how much distance he put between himself and his pursuers, they would never stop. The man's name had been lost to time. He was no longer the person he had been when he had lived on the plantation, when he had been owned, bound by the chains of an institution that saw him as little more than a tool, a possession, an object to be traded and worked to death. His past life was a shadow, a memory of a man who had once had a name, a family, a future. But all of that had been stripped away the moment he had been forced into slavery. Now, he was only a fugitive, a hunted soul running for his life. The man's escape had been a desperate gamble, one that had cost him more than he was willing to admit. He had slipped away in the dead of night, silently slipping through the shadows of the plantation, knowing that if he were caught, he would be punished beyond measure, whipped, branded, or worse. The other slaves had warned him, but he had made up his mind. He could not, would not, live that life any longer. He had heard the stories of those who had escaped before him, those who had found their way north to freedom, to the promise of a life where they were no longer property. It was a dream that had always felt so far away, so unreachable, but in that moment, it was the only thing that kept him moving. Every step had been a battle. The pain in his legs was unbearable, his muscles burning with each movement, but he couldn't stop. The thought of being recaptured, being dragged back to the plantation, was worse than anything he could imagine. He had seen the fate of those who were caught, their bodies broken, their spirits crushed. He had seen the scars, the marks of men and women who had been punished for trying to escape. He couldn't go back to that life. He wouldn't. The woods around him were dark, a suffocating canopy of branches and leaves that seemed to close in on him, obscuring the path ahead. He could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, making the air thick and heavy. The sounds of the forest seemed amplified, the rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig underfoot, each sound a reminder of the danger that lurked just behind him. But there was no time to think about the sounds, no time to dwell on the shadows. His mind was focused solely on putting distance between himself and the people who would stop at nothing to bring him back. He had no plan, no clear direction. All he knew was that he had to keep moving. The farther he could get from the plantation, the better his chances of finding refuge, of finding safety. He had heard stories of the Underground Railroad, of secret paths and hidden stations where runaway slaves could find aid, where they could be sheltered and helped on their journey to freedom. But those were just stories, weren't they? He had no guarantee that any of it was real, that there were people out there who would risk their lives to help him. For all he knew, he was alone in the woods, with nothing but his own wits and strength to carry him through. And yet, despite the uncertainty, there was a flicker of hope within him. A tiny, fragile spark that refused to die, no matter how dark the world around him seemed. That spark was the reason he kept going, the reason he hadn't given up when his body had begged him to stop. The thought of freedom, of a life where he could choose his own path, where he could walk without chains, was enough to push him forward, even as the exhaustion threatened to overtake him. But the world had a way of making hope feel like a distant illusion. As the hours passed and the shadows of the trees grew longer, the man's strength began to wane. His legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. His hands shook as he tried to push himself back up, but his body refused to obey. Every movement felt like a mountain, and the ground beneath him seemed to swallow him whole. He knew that he couldn't keep going like this. He couldn't keep running forever. It was then, in the midst of his desperation, that he saw it, the figure in the distance. At first, it was just a shadow, a fleeting shape that seemed to melt into the darkness. But as he blinked and focused, the figure became clearer. A child. A small figure standing in the clearing, their eyes wide, their posture rigid as though they were waiting for something. The child didn't move, didn't speak, but there was something about the way they stood there, as if they were waiting for him, that drew the man in. He tried to make sense of it. What was a child doing here, alone in the woods, in the middle of the night? But before he could process the thought, the child spoke, their voice soft but steady, carrying through the stillness of the night. "You're safe here," the child said, their words more of a command than a suggestion. The man's heart skipped a beat. Was it a trick? Was this some kind of trap? Was the child in league with the bounty hunters? But the child's eyes, despite the fear that flickered in them, were filled with something else, something that the man had long since stopped believing in, compassion. Without thinking, he found himself stumbling toward the child, his legs trembling with each step. "I can't keep running," he said, his voice barely a whisper, raw with exhaustion. "They'll find me. They'll kill me." The child didn't speak, but instead, stepped forward, gently touching the man's arm, as if to steady him. "They won't find you," the child said. The child's confidence, their certainty, was like a balm to the man's broken spirit. The fugitive's heart beat faster as he allowed himself to believe, if only for a moment, that he might actually be safe, that he might not be alone in this world after all. The child's presence, the simple kindness they had shown him, was a lifeline. And as they led him through the darkened woods, away from the hounds and the hunters, the fugitive couldn't help but wonder how this child had come to be here, in this moment, in this place. What had led them to this chance encounter? The child didn't speak of their family, their home, or their life. They said nothing, but their actions spoke volumes. The man could only follow, trusting this small, fragile figure who had come out of the night to offer him a glimmer of hope in the darkness. They both moved through the woods in silence, each step taking them farther away from the world they had both known, toward a place where the man might have a chance at freedom, and the child, at least for a moment, had made a difference. In a world that seemed determined to crush them both, the fugitive had found an unexpected ally. In a world defined by stark divisions, where loyalty was dictated by the color of one's skin and the weight of history, the child stood at the crossroads of innocence and responsibility. The town of Pinewood was a place where everything was governed by the unspoken rules of tradition and hierarchy, and where those who dared to challenge the system were often silenced, crushed beneath the weight of a society that had lived by one creed for centuries. But in the heart of that same town, in a small, humble farm just beyond the reach of the larger plantations, there lived a child who had not yet been tainted by the prejudices of their world. A child who had not yet learned the harsh realities that shaped the lives of those around them. The child's family was not wealthy by any means. They were poor farmers, struggling to make ends meet in a world where the odds were stacked against them. The father worked the land tirelessly, his hands calloused and worn from the years of labor, while the mother kept the household running with quiet strength and resilience. Their lives were simple, measured by the cycles of the seasons and the hard work that went into every day. Yet, despite their modest means, the family held on to a deep sense of humanity, a kindness, a compassion that set them apart from many of their neighbors. They were a family that understood the value of hard work, but also the importance of helping others, of extending a hand to those in need, even when their own resources were limited. The child, though young, had been raised with this understanding. They had learned the value of empathy from their mother, who would often speak of helping those less fortunate. They had seen their father take in travelers or help neighbors with their crops, even when it meant sacrificing a portion of what little they had. The child had inherited this quiet moral compass, though they had yet to understand the true depth of what that meant in the face of true danger. Life on the farm had been hard, but it had been steady. Each day, the child rose with the sun, worked alongside their parents, and spent the evenings helping with chores or playing in the fields. They were a child of the land, attuned to the rhythms of nature and the simple pleasures of life. Their world was small, contained within the borders of the farm and the town of Pinewood. But within that world, the child found comfort in the routine, in the safety of home, and the predictable passage of time. It was in the midst of this seemingly ordinary life that the child first encountered the fugitive. At first, the man had been nothing more than a shadow in the woods, a fleeting figure that the child had caught a glimpse of from the corner of their eye. But that fleeting moment was enough to set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter the child's life. The child had been playing in the field when they first saw the man. He was tall, dark, and disheveled, his clothes torn and stained with dirt and sweat. His face was drawn with exhaustion, and his eyes held a kind of desperation that spoke of years of pain and suffering. The fugitive had been running, hiding, always looking over his shoulder, always fearing that the next step might be his last. The child had felt a strange pull toward him, an instinctive understanding that this man, this stranger, was not just a figure passing through their world, but someone who needed help. The moment the child's eyes locked with the man's, something passed between them, a silent recognition, a shared understanding. The fugitive, though broken by his circumstances, saw in the child's eyes something he had long since abandoned, hope. It was a fragile thing, born of innocence, and the fugitive clung to it as though it were the only thing keeping him alive. The child, in turn, saw not a stranger, not a fugitive, but a man who had suffered in ways they couldn't fully comprehend, and yet still stood before them with the courage to escape, to fight for his life. Without thinking, the child had stepped forward, cautiously but with purpose. The field was quiet, save for the gentle rustling of the wind through the tall grasses, but the air felt thick with the weight of the decision that was forming in the child's mind. The child didn't know why they moved, only that they couldn't leave this man alone in the field. They didn't understand the full danger of what they were doing, didn't grasp the immense risk of sheltering a runaway slave in a town that upheld slavery as its most sacred institution. But they knew, deep within their heart, that helping him was the right thing to do. It was a decision that came from a place of pure, untainted compassion, unmarred by the prejudices that had shaped the world around them. The child's actions, born of instinct, were not without consequence. The moment they spoke to the man, offering him a place to hide, they set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter the course of their family's history. The fugitive, who had been running for days, was now safe, at least for the moment, hidden in the shadows of the child's world. But the child had no illusions about the dangers that lay ahead. The fugitive's pursuers would not give up easily. They would come searching, and the child and their family would be forced to make a choice, to stand by their actions, or to betray the man they had sworn to protect. As the fugitive followed the child back to their home, the child's heart raced with a mixture of fear and excitement. They had done something they knew was right, but they also understood that they were now inextricably linked to the fugitive's fate. The child didn't know how long they could keep the man hidden, or what would happen if they were caught. But in that moment, the fear was outweighed by something else, a deep, resolute sense of courage. The child knew that they could not turn back now. They had made their choice, and there would be no easy way out. Back at the small farmhouse, the child's parents were already waiting. They had seen the child approaching, leading the fugitive with an air of quiet confidence. The child's mother, though initially startled, did not hesitate. There was no question in her mind about what needed to be done. She could see the same spark of humanity in her child that she had always tried to nurture in her own heart. The father, too, though more hesitant, saw the truth in the child's eyes. He knew that the fugitive's presence in their home would bring danger, but he also knew that the child's courage had made the right decision. The family gathered together, each aware of the immense risk they had taken, but each also bound by an unspoken bond of loyalty to the child's resolve. The fugitive was hidden in the barn, kept away from the prying eyes of the town. For the moment, they were safe. But the danger was far from over. Every creak of the floorboards, every knock at the door, made their hearts skip a beat. The world outside was closing in, and yet, in the small, quiet spaces of their home, they found refuge, not just from the storm that threatened to engulf them, but from the fear that had once defined them. In the weeks that followed, the child's role as protector grew. They brought food to the fugitive, checked on him in the dead of night, ensuring that he remained hidden. They became the bridge between the world of innocence they knew and the harsh, unforgiving world that sought to tear them apart. In the act of protecting the fugitive, the child discovered a depth of courage they had never known they possessed. It was a courage that transcended their youth, transcended the confines of their small world, and reached into the very heart of what it meant to be human. But as the fugitives' time in hiding stretched on, the weight of their decision began to take its toll. The child began to sense the growing unease in their parents, the whispers of doubt that lingered in the corners of their conversations. The risks were mounting, and soon, they would be forced to make a choice, one that would either shatter their world or unite them in ways they never could have imagined. But for now, in the quiet of the barn, the child stood firm, their resolve unwavering. They had chosen a side, and that side was not one of fear or complicity. It was the side of courage, of defiance, and of a hope that burned bright, even in the darkest of times. Pinewood was a town built on silence, a place where the loudest voices were those that called for the preservation of the old ways, the status quo. It was a town where people looked the other way, where the most difficult questions were never asked, and where the consequences of speaking out were as deadly as the fierce summer heat. For generations, the townsfolk had lived in a kind of uneasy equilibrium, where everyone knew their place, and the lines between right and wrong had been carefully blurred. Slavery, though the lifeblood of the Southern economy, was a system so entrenched in the culture of Pinewood that its very existence was seen as natural, as though it were a part of the land itself. But underneath this seemingly perfect social order, there was a quiet undercurrent of fear, the fear that any disruption of the system, any challenge to its foundations, would bring chaos. In Pinewood, most people went about their daily lives with little more than a passing acknowledgement of the horrors that lurked just beyond the horizon. They went to church on Sundays, attended town meetings, and carried on their business, their minds focused on the small concerns of daily life. The cries of the enslaved, the violence visited upon those who tried to escape, the brutal whippings and beatings, these were things that were not spoken of in polite company. They were hidden away in the shadows, in the dark corners of the town, where the public eye could not see them. Pinewood was a town that prided itself on its quiet, controlled facade, and it was a place where any hint of rebellion, any hint of defiance, was seen as a threat to the fragile peace. But as the war raged on, the cracks in this facade began to appear, first in small, subtle ways, whispers in the corners of the town square, glances exchanged between neighbors, the odd disappearance of a few individuals who had chosen to act on their own conscience. Pinewood had always been a town that held its secrets close, but with the world changing, with the Union forces gaining ground, there was a growing sense of unease that could no longer be ignored. The man who had taken refuge on the child's family farm was not the first runaway to pass through Pinewood. He was part of a much larger, much more dangerous movement, a movement that was sweeping through the South like wildfire. More and more enslaved people were choosing to flee, seeking the freedom they had long been denied, risking everything to escape the tyranny of the plantations. The Underground Railroad had become a lifeline for those who dared to dream of a life beyond the fields, beyond the chains. But the path to freedom was fraught with danger, and those who helped the runaways risked their lives just as much as the fugitives themselves. Despite the growing movement, the people of Pinewood had not yet fully acknowledged the severity of the situation. The presence of a runaway slave in their midst, hiding in plain sight, was a reality that most could not, or would not, face. Some denied it altogether, convincing themselves that the fugitive was merely a figment of imagination, an illusion born of fear. Others believed that they could simply ignore the situation, that it would go away on its own if they turned a blind eye. For the most part, the town's residents had convinced themselves that the risks of harboring a fugitive were too great. They were too afraid of the repercussions, too afraid of what might happen if the authorities came knocking on their doors. But there were always those who could not ignore the injustice before them, those who could not live in a world where they turned their backs on human suffering. The child's family, though cautious, knew that they had made a choice to protect a fellow human being in the face of overwhelming odds. But the weight of that choice, the consequences of harboring a fugitive, were heavy. They had taken in a man not out of some misguided sense of heroism, but because they could not abide by the cruelty that had defined their world. In the days that followed, the tension in Pinewood began to mount. The town square, usually a place of bustling activity and chatter, had grown quieter, as if everyone were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. People exchanged nervous glances as they passed each other, avoiding any direct mention of the fugitive, but the knowledge that he was somewhere nearby hung like a dark cloud over everything. The fear was palpable, a kind of collective unease that made it difficult to even speak freely. People were afraid of the repercussions, afraid of what would happen if anyone found out that they had been harboring a runaway slave. The local sheriff, a man who had built his reputation on maintaining order and upholding the law, had been among the first to notice the subtle shifts in the town's atmosphere. He was a man of duty, loyal to the Southern cause, and he had seen firsthand the lengths to which the abolitionists would go to undermine the system. The sheriff had heard the whispers about a runaway hiding somewhere in Pinewood, and though he had not yet gathered enough evidence to act, he could sense the tension growing. The town was on edge, and it would only be a matter of time before someone made a mistake, before the truth came to light. But no one spoke openly about the fugitive. No one would admit to seeing anything. The town held its breath, as if in denial, as if they could pretend the problem didn't exist long enough for it to go away. The townspeople, caught between their loyalty to the system and the guilt of knowing what was happening, chose silence. It was easier to deny what was happening than to confront the moral ambiguity that hung in the air. If no one spoke of it, then it wasn't real, wasn't happening. The child's family knew this. They knew that the town would turn a blind eye as long as they could. But the question remained, for how long? In the dark corners of Pinewood, there were those who knew the truth, those who had seen the child slip away with the fugitive, who had heard the hushed conversations late at night. The fear of speaking out was pervasive, but the knowledge that the town was harboring a fugitive slave became too much for some to ignore. There were whispers, rumors that spread like wildfire, but still no open confrontation. The town's inhabitants were locked in a dance of denial, too afraid of the consequences to take a stand, too ingrained in the values of their world to act on the knowledge they possessed. Some members of the town began to ask questions, quiet, careful questions, but they did so in hushed tones, as if hoping that no one else would hear. The fear of punishment, of retribution, was real. The laws of the land were clear: anyone who helped a runaway slave was guilty of treason, of aiding in the rebellion against the Confederacy. The punishment was severe. And yet, even in the face of such fear, there was something else stirring in the hearts of a few, something that whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, this silence could not go on forever. The moral weight of turning a blind eye to human suffering was too much for some, and even in the face of danger, there were those who could not live with their own complicity. The child's family, caught between their desire to protect the fugitive and the suffocating pressure of the town's silence, began to feel the weight of their decision. The fugitive had been hidden well, and the family had taken every precaution, but the atmosphere in Pinewood was growing more dangerous by the day. The walls seemed to close in, the town itself becoming a prison of its own making. The child's role in this silent rebellion was more important than ever, though they were too young to fully understand the full scope of what had been set into motion. The fugitive's presence in their home was not just a challenge to the laws of the land but to the very fabric of the town's identity. The people of Pinewood might have remained in denial for a little longer, but the truth was already beginning to surface, like a shadow creeping along the edges of the night. And when the truth finally came, it would not be in whispers or rumors. It would come in a loud, unforgiving crash that would shatter the silence forever. But for now, the town waited. It waited in denial, it waited in fear, but it would not remain silent for long. The days in Pinewood stretched on, slow and heavy, like the oppressive heat that hung in the air, refusing to relent even as the world around it changed. The quiet unease that had settled over the town after the fugitive's arrival began to grow, its presence more palpable with each passing moment. The child's family, once sure of their decision to protect the man, now found themselves wrestling with an invisible enemy that loomed larger than the fugitive himself. The world they had known, a world defined by predictable rhythms and unspoken rules, was slowly but surely slipping out of their grasp. The fugitive, who had once been nothing more than a shadow on the horizon, now lived in their barn, hidden away from the watchful eyes of Pinewood's residents. The family took every precaution to keep him safe, locking the barn doors at night, keeping the windows tightly shut, and ensuring that no one saw him during the day. Yet the fugitive's presence was not just a physical weight on their home, it had begun to infiltrate the very atmosphere of their lives. What had begun as a quiet act of compassion, a simple decision to help a fellow human being, now felt like a slow burn, each passing day feeding the fear that had begun to settle like dust in the corners of their lives. It was the child who first began to feel the true weight of their actions. Initially, they had believed that helping the fugitive was a simple matter of right and wrong, that there was no room for doubt, no need for second-guessing. After all, what could be more just than offering aid to someone who was fighting for their life, fighting for their freedom? But the complexities of the situation slowly crept into the child's understanding. They began to see the way their parents looked at each other when they thought no one was watching, the furtive glances exchanged over dinner, the tension that hung in the air like smoke. The child, once unaware of the larger implications of their actions, now felt the full weight of what had been set in motion. As days turned to weeks, the town's subtle shift toward suspicion became more evident. It started with small things, a neighbor eyeing the barn a little too long, a familiar face asking a few too many questions in passing, but it escalated quickly. There were rumors, whispers in the street, in the local tavern, at the church. Pinewood was a small town, and news traveled faster than anyone cared to admit. The child overheard bits of conversation, snatches of gossip that made their stomach tighten in knots. A pair of local men had been spotted outside the barn late one evening, peering in through the cracks in the walls, and one of them had been overheard saying something about keeping an eye on things. These small acts of suspicion were the cracks that would soon widen into a chasm, threatening to engulf the child and their family. The fugitive's presence, though never spoken of directly, had become the town's unspoken obsession. It was as if everyone knew, but no one wanted to confront the truth. The public denial that had once been so effective began to falter under the weight of the tension that filled the air. And for the child, this unspoken knowledge became a constant companion, like a shadow that never left, no matter how hard they tried to shake it off. Every creak of the floorboards, every knock at the door, made their hearts skip a beat. They could feel the eyes of the town on them, even when they weren't watching. The child's once carefree life had become a tightrope walk, each step fraught with danger. It wasn't just the fear of discovery that weighed on the child. It was the slow, insidious realization that their actions, however well-intentioned, had set them on a path that was impossible to turn back from. The fugitive, whose life had been one of constant fear and flight, was now entangled with theirs in ways that could not be undone. The child began to understand, in the way that only children can, that the stakes were higher than they had ever imagined. They had helped someone escape the bonds of slavery, but they had also, in a sense, placed themselves in bondage as well. They were now prisoners of their own choices, bound by a moral obligation that could cost them everything. For the child's parents, the psychological toll was just as great, though it manifested in different ways. The mother, once a pillar of strength and composure, found herself staring out the window at the passing days, her thoughts distant, her mind consumed with worry. She had always been the one to hold the family together, the one who kept the home steady and the hearth warm, but now she found herself in a constant state of unease, questioning whether they had done the right thing. Every time the door opened, her heart raced with the fear that it would be someone from town, someone who had finally pieced together the puzzle and would bring the authorities to their door. She had never considered the implications of harboring a fugitive so deeply until now, when it seemed as if the very fabric of their lives was unraveling before her eyes. The father, too, had his own silent struggle. He had always been a man of action, a man who prided himself on his ability to provide for his family, to protect them from harm. But now, he found himself paralyzed, caught between his sense of duty to his family and his growing fear that the choices they had made would lead them into the heart of a storm that they would not be able to weather. Each night, as he lay awake beside his wife, his thoughts were consumed with what-ifs. What if someone found out? What if the fugitives' presence in their barn was the spark that ignited something far more dangerous? He found himself questioning everything, the decisions he had made, the values he had held, even his own sense of right and wrong. The weight of the secret they were keeping pressed down on him with a suffocating intensity, and he could not shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. It was in these moments, late at night when the world outside was quiet, that the family's fragile unity began to fray. Though they had acted together in the beginning, they now found themselves alone with their thoughts, each wrestling with their own fears and doubts. The psychological toll of harboring a fugitive had begun to tear at the seams of their home. It wasn't just the fear of discovery, it was the growing awareness that their actions had irrevocably altered the course of their lives. No matter what happened now, they could never go back to the life they had known before the fugitive had appeared in their world. For the fugitive, too, the psychological impact of his time in hiding began to take its toll. He had spent years running from the law, always one step ahead of those who would drag him back into captivity. But here, in the small barn that had become his refuge, he found himself trapped in a different kind of prison, the prison of his own mind. The constant fear that the walls would close in on him, that someone would betray him, that his time was running out, gnawed at him like an unhealed wound. Though he was safe for the moment, his mind was constantly at war with the reality that his freedom was fragile, that it could slip away at any time. He found himself awake at night, listening for footsteps in the distance, his heart racing at every unfamiliar sound. His body had been freed from the chains that had once bound him, but his mind was still shackled by the fear that had defined his entire existence. The fugitive's presence, once a spark of hope, had become a constant reminder of the fear that gripped them all. Each day, each hour that passed, seemed to bring them all closer to the breaking point. The weight of their decision had begun to feel unbearable, the anxiety and fear choking off the small joys of their lives. What had once seemed like an act of compassion had become a psychological labyrinth, with no clear way out. As the days turned into weeks, the family found themselves facing the inevitable truth: there was no turning back from the choices they had made. They were in too deep, and the psychological impact of their actions would haunt them, whether they were discovered or not. The fear, the doubt, the constant state of alertness, it would shape them, just as it had shaped the fugitive, forever altering the course of their lives. The weight of the secret they kept was more than just the fear of discovery, it was the realization that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And as they looked into each other's eyes, they knew that the escalation of their situation was no longer just about survival. It was about the toll it had taken on their very souls. As the fugitive's presence continued to simmer under the surface of Pinewood, a strange mixture of scientific curiosity and local folklore began to emerge among the town's residents. Pinewood was a place that had always relied on tradition, on the steady march of agricultural cycles, on the unspoken rules that governed how things worked. But as the whispers of the runaway's escape and the child's involvement began to spread, people started searching for explanations that would bring a sense of order to the unsettling chaos that was slowly engulfing their lives. Some turned to the teachings of the Bible, others to superstition, and still others looked for answers in the realm of science. For those in Pinewood, reality was a canvas painted by the brushstrokes of both the rational and the irrational, the observable and the imagined. The first signs of this shift came in the form of local gossip, whispered between neighbors, passed along at the local tavern or in hushed tones during Sunday church services. The fugitive, whose very existence seemed to defy the rules of the town, became the subject of much speculation. Some of the older residents, those who had lived through more turbulent times, spoke of the runaway's presence in Pinewood as an omen, a sign of something greater, something far beyond the grasp of ordinary understanding. To them, the man wasn't just an escaped slave, he was a symbol of rebellion, of change, of a world that was no longer as it once had been. Stories of the supernatural began to circulate, as they often did in small, insular communities like Pinewood. The local women, who were known for their superstitions and their belief in the unseen, began to speak of the fugitive's arrival as a kind of curse. There were whispers that the man was no ordinary runaway, but someone marked by the spirits, someone whose very presence was capable of bringing calamity to the town. Some believed that he had been touched by the devil, that his escape was part of some larger, more sinister plan. The older folk would tell stories of cursed runaways, of slaves who had escaped only to bring ruin to the places they fled to, a cycle of misfortune that had been seen throughout the South for generations. But in the midst of these superstitions, there were also those who tried to explain the situation through a more scientific lens. The town's doctor, a man of some education and rationality, began to take an interest in the strange events surrounding the fugitive. Dr. Gray, who had always prided himself on his logical mind, started to speculate that the town's increasing paranoia could be attributed to the stress and tension brought about by the ongoing war. The South was teetering on the edge of collapse, and the constant strain of fighting, of defending a way of life that was crumbling before their eyes, was taking its toll on the people's mental health. In Dr. Gray's view, the whispers, the fears, and the strange behavior of the townsfolk could be explained by a collective hysteria, a mass psychosis fueled by the overwhelming sense of impending doom. Dr. Gray's theory was met with a mixture of skepticism and cautious acceptance. While the townspeople weren't necessarily inclined to believe in the doctor's more clinical explanations, his authority and position in the community gave his words weight. The idea that the town's unease could be reduced to the psychology of fear was comforting to some. It was easier to believe that their anxieties were merely the result of the stresses of war, of the pressure they all felt living in such uncertain times. In a world where everything seemed to be changing, where the future was filled with a haze of doubt, it was reassuring to think that fear itself was the culprit, something intangible, something that could be understood, and perhaps even controlled. But not everyone was convinced by the doctor's rational explanations. The tension that gripped Pinewood was more than just fear, it was something deeper, something rooted in the very soul of the town. The fugitive's arrival had disrupted the natural order of things, had forced the people of Pinewood to confront a reality they had long avoided. The tension was not just in their minds, it was in the air they breathed, in the way the sun seemed to set too early, in the way the wind whispered through the trees with a strange and unsettling urgency. The atmosphere of the town had changed, and with it, so had the people. One evening, as the shadows lengthened and the streets grew quiet, a group of townsfolk gathered at the local inn. The conversation, as it often did, turned to the subject of the runaway. Some spoke in fearful tones, convinced that the fugitive was a harbinger of bad luck. Others, emboldened by their own growing anxieties, began to offer theories that blurred the line between the scientific and the supernatural. One man, a carpenter by trade, suggested that the runaway's presence was not merely a result of the war or the political climate, but a sign of a greater cosmic struggle. He spoke of the world being out of balance, of a reckoning that was coming, and how the arrival of the fugitive was just the beginning of a series of events that would bring about a change far greater than anyone could comprehend. The carpenter's words, though steeped in superstition, struck a chord with some of the listeners. They began to speak in hushed voices, sharing stories of other towns where runaway slaves had appeared, bringing with them a wave of misfortune. Stories of strange accidents, of crops failing, of children falling ill, of buildings collapsing, these were the kinds of tales that circulated in a place like Pinewood. The carpenter's words, though vague and unsubstantiated, became another thread in the fabric of fear that now enveloped the town. People began to wonder, was the fugitive truly just a man fleeing for his life, or was he something more? Was he a symbol of a greater power, a force that none of them could control? In the midst of all this, the town's pastor, a man who had long held sway over the hearts and minds of Pinewood's residents, spoke in defense of the runaway. He argued that to help the fugitive was not only the right thing to do, but the Christian thing to do. We are all children of God, he said, his voice steady, and we are all called to help those in need. To turn our backs on a fellow human being is to turn our backs on God himself. The pastor's words resonated with some, but for others, they felt like a challenge, a test of faith that they were not prepared to face. The town, divided between those who sought rational explanations and those who believed in the power of the supernatural, found itself caught in a kind of moral and psychological paralysis. Despite these attempts to explain the situation, there was no clear consensus. Dr. Gray's scientific theories were met with equal parts acceptance and doubt, while the pastor's moral pleas were met with skepticism and resentment. The folklore, steeped in fear and superstition, gained traction among those who were already on edge, already primed to believe that something larger than the fugitive himself was at play. The situation in Pinewood became more and more surreal, as the townspeople grappled with their inability to reconcile the real and the imagined, the logical and the mystical. The child, who had once believed that their actions were simple, black and white decisions, began to feel the weight of the town's confusion. They had never considered how deeply entrenched the beliefs of their neighbors were, how difficult it would be to reconcile their own sense of justice with the widespread fear that was slowly consuming the town. The child, caught between the pressure of the family's secret and the growing tension of the town, began to feel as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The lines between what was real and what was imagined blurred, and every encounter, every whisper, every glance from a neighbor seemed laden with unspoken meanings. In the end, the attempt to explain the fugitive's presence in Pinewood was futile. Whether the explanations came from science or folklore, whether they were rational or supernatural, they all failed to address the true core of the situation. The town was not merely faced with a runaway slave, it was faced with a choice, one that would tear apart the very heart of its identity. And as the days passed and the tension continued to build, the people of Pinewood would have to decide whether they would continue to live in denial, or whether they would confront the truth of what was happening in their midst. The town of Pinewood, once a place of quiet stability, had begun to unravel at an alarming pace. The very foundation upon which it stood, the unspoken rules, the complacency that had defined generations, was no longer enough to hold back the forces of change that were sweeping through. The fugitive, though still hidden in the shadows of the child's family barn, had become a catalyst for something far greater than anyone had anticipated. The slow, steady erosion of the town's structure was not just a result of his presence, but of the psychological and moral fractures that had always been lurking beneath the surface, waiting for something to bring them to light. It was as if the town's very soul had become infected. The fears that had once simmered quietly under the surface now surged with relentless intensity. The town, isolated by its own refusal to face the truth, found itself teetering on the edge of collapse. The once strong sense of community that had held Pinewood together was beginning to fray. Neighbors who had once shared meals and offered help without a second thought now eyed each other warily, suspicion hanging in the air like a thick fog. The simple rituals of daily life, church services, market visits, and even casual conversations, had lost their ease, replaced by a kind of strained formality, as if everyone were waiting for something to break. The sense of isolation, both physical and emotional, began to settle over the town. Pinewood, already a small and insular place, felt even more distant from the world outside. The news of the war's progression reached them only in fragments, rumors and hearsay passed from traveler to traveler, often exaggerated or distorted to fit the fears and anxieties of those who carried them. The town, perched on the edge of the conflict, was cut off from the larger world, and it became clear that it was no longer part of the same reality as the rest of the nation. In the larger scope of history, Pinewood was a microcosm, an isolated speck caught in the tide of a larger, far-reaching struggle. But in that moment, the town was all they knew, and its isolation felt like a prison. The child, now more aware than ever of the consequences of their actions, felt the weight of this isolation acutely. In the past, they had thought of the world beyond Pinewood as distant and abstract, a place that existed outside of their small, safe sphere. But now, they realized that they were trapped within the very walls they had once believed were protective. The knowledge that the fugitive's presence was a secret that could shatter everything they had known was suffocating. It wasn't just the fear of being discovered, it was the realization that Pinewood had become a place of refuge not just for the runaway slave, but for their own guilt, for their own complicity in this rebellion against the system. The child had never imagined that helping someone could feel so much like a form of imprisonment. As the days dragged on, the psychological toll began to deepen. The townspeople, already on edge, began to behave in increasingly erratic ways. Small incidents of violence, arguments in the street, and a growing sense of paranoia began to dominate daily life. It was as if the very fabric of the town had been torn apart, leaving its people unmoored, drifting in an emotional landscape that had once seemed familiar, but was now terrifyingly alien. The isolation that the townspeople felt was not just physical, but emotional. Each person was alone with their fears, unable or unwilling to connect with others, even those they had known for years. The town's leadership, once a cohesive and steady force, began to splinter. The sheriff, a man who had long been the unquestioned authority in Pinewood, became increasingly erratic. His once steadfast belief in the law, in the system that had defined the town for so long, began to falter. He had been watching the fugitive for weeks, searching for the slightest sign, the smallest piece of evidence that could give him the justification he needed to act. But as the days passed, his obsession with the case began to consume him. His once pragmatic approach to law enforcement turned to paranoia, his every action dictated by a need to find the runaway and restore the town to what it had been. The pressure of maintaining control, of holding on to the old ways, had twisted him into something unrecognizable. He had become a man driven not by reason, but by fear, fear of losing his grip on the town, fear of losing control of the narrative, fear of confronting the reality that Pinewood was no longer the place it had once been. Meanwhile, the child's parents began to sense that something was deeply wrong. Their home, once a haven, had become a place of constant tension. The quiet was no longer comforting, it was oppressive. Each sound, the creak of the floorboards, the rustling of the wind in the trees, was a reminder of the fugitive hiding in the barn, of the danger that loomed just beyond their door. They had made their choice, but it was becoming increasingly clear that their decision had consequences far beyond what they had imagined. The family had once been united, bound by a shared sense of moral clarity, but now they found themselves drifting apart. The mother, who had always been the emotional center of the family, began to retreat into herself. Her worry, once an ever-present but manageable force, became all-consuming. Her faith, which had once been a source of strength, now felt like a fragile thread that threatened to snap at the slightest tug. The father, too, had begun to crack under the pressure. His once steadfast resolve had begun to erode, replaced by doubt. He could no longer ignore the fact that they were not just harboring a fugitive, they were defying the very fabric of the society they had once been part of. He had always prided himself on his ability to protect his family, but now he found himself powerless, trapped by the consequences of their actions. Each passing day brought him closer to a breaking point he could no longer ignore. In the midst of this growing crisis, the fugitive's presence began to take on a new significance. At first, he had been nothing more than a man in need of help, a fellow human being fleeing for his life. But as time went on, the fugitive became something more. He was no longer just a person, he had become a symbol of everything that Pinewood was afraid of the forces of change, of the collapse of the old order, of the irreversibility of what had been set in motion. The fugitive was both a reflection of the moral dilemmas the town faced and a mirror to their own fears. He had come to represent not just the fight for freedom, but the fight for their own souls. The sense of isolation in Pinewood grew to such an extent that the town seemed to vanish into itself. It became a place trapped in time, a microcosm of a world on the brink of transformation but unable, or unwilling, to change. The once vibrant life that had characterized the town now seemed to fade away, replaced by an oppressive silence. The businesses grew quieter, the streets emptier. The town's spirit had been drained, leaving behind only hollow echoes of what it had been. The people, once connected by shared history and purpose, now found themselves divided, each one struggling with their own personal demons, their own sense of guilt and fear. And then, one fateful day, the inevitable happened. The fugitive was discovered. It wasn't some grand confrontation, no dramatic moment of capture or rescue. It was a small thing, a slip, a momentary lapse in vigilance that shattered the fragile equilibrium that had held the town together. Someone, no one knew who, had seen something, heard something, and the word spread like wildfire. The sheriff, in his obsessive quest to restore order, was the first to act. He rallied a small group of men, and they made their way to the farm. In that moment, the town of Pinewood seemed to hold its breath. The people, once so united in their denial, now faced the truth. The fugitive, the child, and the family stood at the heart of it all, their world collapsing in on them. The isolation they had felt for so long had become their undoing. And as the sheriff and his men approached, it was clear that there was no escape from the choices they had made. The town had vanished into its own darkness, and now, it was time to face the consequences.